Hi. So, in our last discussion, we looked at the phenomena of cooperation and we saw how relatedness amongst individuals can explain cooperation to a great degree. But as I said, cooperation is just one part of the story. The other thing that happens a lot between organisms are conflicts, due to various evolutionary reasons, due to selection operating in certain ways. So, this particular discussion today is going to be entirely on evolutionary conflicts, and one of the most interesting and eye-catching conflict that we get is what is known as infanticide. So, what is infanticide? So, I am sure people in India are aware of this animal. This is the so called Hanuman langur or Semnopithecus entellus. So, this is found pretty much all over India, and in this particular organism, groups are made up of a single dominant male, and around that male are multiple females. Now, the dominant male has a total reproductive monopoly over the females. That means that it does not allow any of the other males to mate with the females. So, obviously, that means that the subordinate males in the group, their reproductive success is much lower. I mean, the best that they can do is to sneak a mating when the dominant male is not looking, and even that is very fraught with danger, because if the dominant male discovers such a sneaky mating, it is going to react rather violently. So, the subordinate males, obviously they do not like it, and very often they will fight to take over the dominant male role in the group, and when that happens, typically either they will kill or they will banish the dominant male away, and they will now become the group leader. Interestingly, when a new male takes over, the first thing that the new male does is that he kills all the infants that were not sired by him and produced by the other females. Now, this behavior, although I am talking about it in the context of the Hanuman langur, it is by no means only restricted to this animal. It is there in many other animals. For example, in many lions this happens, and many other mammals etc. show this. But why? Why exactly is this happening? So, turns out that female mammals, they are not going to ovulate typically while they are lactating, while they are producing milk. Therefore, and at the same time, if you take a lactating female and you kill its infant, so there is no more infant to feed, now the female will stop lactating, and that is the point when the male can now have access to the female and mate with it and produce a new baby. In other words, the dominant male, if it does not kill off the female's kids, then it is going to have to wait to reproduce, whereas if it kills them off, then it can start its reproduction very soon. Now, this is very important for the dominant male, because remember, once a subordinate has become a dominant, there are other subordinates in the group which are waiting to challenge. Therefore, the dominant does not have too long a time before it can reproduce, and if it spends all that time in waiting, then that is not really going to work. Therefore, the dominant male needs to start reproducing as soon as possible, and the best way for that is to kill off all the existing babies such that the females become receptive to mating. In other words, all these males who show this infanticidal behavior, they are the ones who are going to have a larger reproductive success. Well, as I said, this is something that has been seen in many other groups. Mostly it is the males, but does that mean that it is a male specific behavior? And turns out that although it is mostly males, there are cases where there is a role reversal and the female can also become infanticidal. So, a very famous case is that of this bird. It is wattled jacana, and in this particular case, the males are the ones who are responsible for brooding and taking care of the young. So, what happens is that the female ends up defending a territory inside which there are male jacanas who are standing and guarding the brood, guarding the eggs. Now, if you end up killing a female or otherwise removing it from the territory, the other females who are around that area, they will quickly come over and they will attack the chicks and they will either kill them or they will evict them from the nest, which obviously typically leads to their death. The moment that happens, the male now becomes receptive to mating and then it mates with the attacking female and now starts taking care of her offspring. So, this is just to show that whichever sex is doing the parental care, the other sex is doing the infanticide. Typically, it is the females who do the parental care, which is why the males do the infanticide, but if you have the whole role reversed, then you can have infanticide by females as well. But the important point to note over here is that this does not really lead to a situation like this. This does not imply a situation like this where the father or the mother is sitting with a calculator and trying to calculate what is my relatedness and what is my reproductive success, and then it says therefore I need to kill the baby. No, it is not necessarily a conscious decision. All that is needed in this case is some kind of a genetic predisposition to kill off other males or females babies, and if you have such a predisposition, then that predisposition or the tendency is going to be evolutionarily favored. Now, of course, in a situation like this where you have babies sired by other males or produced by other females, then it is very easy to explain evolutionarily why it is going to be favored, my offspring versus other people's offspring. But there are several situations where some organisms actually kill their own offspring, or in many cases they even end up killing their relatives. Now, we have already discussed about inclusive fitness. So, we know that killing of your relatives is not a very great idea. It reduces your inclusive fitness. Therefore, under what kind of a scenario will a parent decide to kill its babies, or will a brother decides to kill its brothers or half brothers or so on? In order to understand this, we have to do some kind of a evolutionary cost benefit analysis, factoring in how much is the cost / benefit of producing babies versus how much is the inclusive fitness of killing your babies or killing your relatives and so on. So, I will show you a very famous graphical model. This is the very important point to note. This is not a mathematical model. There are no equations underlying this. It is a logical thing, and the logic is given in the form of a graph, and I will show you what is the logic behind the graph. So, let us assume that we have parental investment on x axis and the cost or the benefit on the y axis. Now, in order for any offspring to survive, it requires some resources. Okay. Either the resources have to be provided in the form of the proteins etc. surrounding the nucleus, or it has to be some amount of parental care. If there is zero resource investment by the parents, then the chances of an offspring surviving is close to zero. That is why when the offspring, or rather when the parent starts investing, then in the initial phase the benefit to the offspring goes up very sharply. So, that is what is being shown over here in this cyan line. So, as the parental investment starts increasing, the benefit to the offspring increases very sharply. However, we are talking about the survivorship of the offspring or the fecundity of the offspring, and there is a point after which if the parents end up giving further nourishment, further resources, further parental care, then the survivorship has to taper off at 1, right? It has to plateau at 1. Therefore, after the initial sharp increase, after some point the rate at which the benefit increases slows down, and at some point it kind of levels off, right. So, that is what is leading to the shape of this graph. So, it does not really matter what functional form or what parameter values are used to draw this. All that matters is the appreciation that initially it is going to rise sharply, and then after some point it is going to taper off, and then at some point it will level off. Okay. So, this is the benefit to the offspring. Now, obviously, when a parent is making an investment, then that is coming at a cost to the parent. Now, what is the cost in terms of? So, in this particular case, we talk about the cost in terms of missed reproductive opportunity. So, in other words, that if I were giving, let us say, this much of extra offspring care, care to the offspring, then I am missing out on making these many number of babies. Okay. So, the cost is to be thought in terms of a missed opportunity. Now, obviously, as the parental investment increases, this cost keeps on increasing. Now, here you have to appreciate one thing, that a parent in a diploid case is always related to its offspring by half. Okay, R is equal to half. So, it is related to all its offspring by the same amount. Therefore, genetically speaking, in terms of relatedness, all offspring are the same for the parent, and hence the cost of the parent actually keeps on increasing monotonically, right. As it keeps on increasing more and more in the offspring, the total amount of more and more in the existing offspring, the total amount of loss that it incurs in terms of getting future offspring, that keeps on increasing monotonically. Great. So, where exactly is the parent's reproductive success maximized? The parent's reproductive success is of course maximized where the gap between these two graphs, the cyan graph and this orange graph, that gap is maximum, right. Benefit minus cost, the maximum difference between that is the profit. So, that maximum in this particular case, let us say it happens over here. Exactly. Where it happens is not the point. The point is that there is, given the nature of these graphs, there is going to be a point where the difference is going to be maximum, and this is where the parent gets the maximum net reproductive success, right. So, that is what is shown by this difference over here. Great. So, this is the parent's side of the story. Now, what is happening to the offspring? Remember, the parent is related equally to all the offspring, but when it comes to the offspring's relatedness to itself is 1, but its relatedness to its siblings, assuming that we are talking about full siblings, that relatedness is half, 50%, right. So, the offspring would obviously want more and more resource for itself, even if it comes at a cost to its siblings, to its brothers or sisters. However, here the inclusive fitness also becomes a thing. If it ends up taking everything for itself, let us assume there is one offspring who ends up taking entire resources for himself or herself, because of which no further offspring are being produced by the parent. In that case, the offspring is actually going to have a direct fitness, but it is also going to lose out on the inclusive fitness, the indirect fitness that is coming through its relatives. Therefore, the offspring also feels this cost, but the cost is felt by the offspring in a very different way. As I said, the offspring is related to itself by 1, offspring is related to its full sib by half. Therefore, all the extra investment that the parent is making, the offspring discounts it by 50% because of its 50% relatedness to its sibling, and that 50% reduction is what I am showing you in this particular graph, this whatever violet or purple, whatever you call it. So, that is, this graph is 50% of this orange graph, and because it is 50%, it is going to be at a lower level, it is going to have a shallower slope, and because it is going to have a shallower slope, the maximum difference between the benefit to the offspring and the cost discounted by 50%, that is this graph, that is going to come towards the right. In other words, the offspring would want the parent to keep on giving investment, keep on increasing the parental investment such that the maximum inclusive fitness in the context of full SIBS happens over here. This is at a higher value of parental investment compared to what is optimal for the parent, right. And this is when we are talking about full SIBS. Suppose you have, let us say, one mother but multiple fathers, or the other way around. So, then the offspring are all related to each other by 1/4, and that is this graph, this one, this pink one. So, obviously, in this case the maximum inclusive fitness is going to be even more towards the right hand side. So, this graphical model that I told you, this is what is known as parent offspring conflict, and this was proposed by Robert Trivers in the year 1974. It is a very famous, highly cited paper where he essentially proposes this graphical model. So, now what I will do is I will essentially repeat this entire thing, but now instead of referring to the graph, I will just use simple words to say the same thing. So, this is just to reinforce what the concept that we just now discussed. So, parent offspring conflict. What is the parent's view? The parent has equal relatedness with all its children, and therefore, it values all its children equally, and therefore, for the parent all it wants to do is to maximize the number of offspring that are surviving. The offspring on the other side has a 100% relatedness with itself, but only 50% relatedness with its full SIBS and 25% relatedness with its half SIBS. Okay. In other words, its relatedness to itself is more than its relatedness to its SIBS, and therefore, the offspring, if it has to maximize its inclusive fitness, it actually wants the parent to invest a lot more than what the parent wants to invest based on equal distribution, right. The offspring wants to pull the resources more, and because of this the cost of the parent is in terms of the missed opportunity to produce a future offspring, but the offspring is going to discount this cost by 50% because the offspring is after all related to its potential future siblings only by 50%, right. And therefore, because it is discounting the cost that the parent is paying, the offspring wants the parent to invest more and more. So, this is at the crux, this is like the basis because of which the evolutionary interest of the parent is very different from the evolutionary interest of the offspring. So, obviously, you can see that there is a parent side of the story here and there is a offspring side of the story here. So, what we are going to do is we are going to first look at what the parent does in 3 or 4 scenarios, and then we are going to look at what the offspring does. So, in the context of the parents, the most interesting and apparently confusing thing that people often see is what is known as filicide, or also known as filial cannibalism. So, this is the situation wherein parents kill their own offspring, and this is extremely widely found in insects, fishes, birds, mammals, huge number of examples. So, as I said, on the face of it, it makes no sense because it apparently reduces the parent's fitness. However, if you look at it closely, there seems to be hidden benefits that the parents can get by killing and in some cases eating and in some cases not eating their own offspring. So, we are going to talk about 3-4 of those. So, the first case that we are talking about is in the context of this beetle known as a burying beetle, Necrophorus orbicolis, right. So, this beetle is a fascinating organism. So, it's the way it works is something like this. So, whenever there is a mammal, okay, let us say a mouse or a squirrel, small mammals, whenever they die, these beetles will go and they will find these insects. They have these small mammals. They have very nice sensory systems to locate these dead mammals. So, once they find these dead mammals, they will quickly bury them in the ground, and once buried they will keep on rolling that animal. Okay. Remember, the animal has started slightly decaying, so it has started becoming soft. So, then they end up making it into some kind of a ball like this, right. Then can you see these white dots over here? These are the eggs. So, they do not lay the eggs on the animal, they lay the eggs slightly away from the animal, and the eggs hatch, larvae are formed, and these larvae they slowly crawl to that animal and they start eating the animal. And then they get all the nourishment from the animals, and after some time, here are the larvae, and after some time they form the adults and so on. So, once the larvae have started going out, then the two parent beetles they just disperse. Now, it sounds a bit gruesome. If you want to see live photographs of this, you can check out this particular paper, but the main point that I wanted to show you is this cycle. Now, turns out that in this case, see, not all mammals are of the same size, right. You can have a large squirrel of about this size, or you can have a small mouse of about this size. So, the larger the food source, the more is the number of the surviving offspring. But very interestingly, the size of the surviving offspring, which is a very good measure of how much food they are getting per capita, that size of the surviving offspring remains exactly the same irrespective of the size of the food source. In other words, even if you have a small mouse like this, or you have a large squirrel like this, the surviving babies of this particular beetle, they will always be of the same size. So, how is that happening? One possibility is that if they have large food source, they may lay more eggs. If they have small food source, they may lay less eggs, right. But turns out that that is not what happens. The number of eggs that these beetles lay, they are statistically similar irrespective of the size of the food source. So, if that be the case, there is some kind of a regulation that is happening at some point. So, one possibility is that maybe there is a lot of competition between the larvae and only a fixed number or only a fixed fraction is able to survive. But if you directly observe the beetles, and which is what was done by Wilson and Fudge, you realize that that is not what is really happening. What is really happening is that they lay as many eggs as they want to, but later they actually kill and eat some of the larvae, and the control that they do is proportional to how much food they have. They have more food, they kill less number of larvae, they have less food, they kill more number of larvae, but what they ensure is that the amount of food available per larva is more or less constant. And because of this, the remaining larvae, they have sufficient amount of food to grow, and therefore, this is infanticide is a way that is being used by the parents to control the family size such that all larvae end up getting similar amount of food. Now, of course, one can ask the question over here, then doesn't it seem a little bit wasteful? Would it not have been better if they had evolved a way of laying more eggs or less eggs depending on whether they had more food or less food? Correct, it would have been, but look, not all solutions that make sense to a human being or an engineer is what the organism will be able to execute. Maybe it does not have the genes to do that kind of a sensing. But anyway, that apart, the main point that I am trying to make over here is that organisms can use infanticide to reduce competition for food among their babies. So, that is one. Another way in which organisms sometimes use infanticide is to recover the resources, and this is found, for example, in a big way in these polar bears. So, you know, polar bears are probably the largest amongst all the bears. They are certainly the most carnivorous amongst all the bears. So, in these cases it is well known that the male bears, they kill the cubs of other males to bring the females back to estrus, so that they can mate. That part is not what we are dealing here, that part is not surprising. The surprising bit is that female polar bears, sometimes they end up killing their own babies, and this typically happens during two stages. Either when there is extreme starvation, there is no food and the female is on the cusp of death, then, or if the baby is extremely weak and the baby is highly unlikely to survive, even in that case the female can kill the baby and eat it. So, this is thought more in terms of, you know, recovering the resource so that they are able to survive longer. The third interesting way, I mean, obviously see, recovering the resource in this way works if you are a carnivore. There are situations where organisms weed out the weaklings without necessarily eating them. So, this is the golden takin. This is the kind of goat which is found only in China, it is native to China. And in this particular case, what happens is that once the baby is born, the mother actively tries to help the baby to get up on its legs. Now, most of the babies, they are able to do so within a very short amount of time, but sometimes there are weaklings which are produced, very weak babies, who even after several tries and a lot of the help from the mother, they are unable to get up. When that happens, then there is, it has been seen that typically about 50 minutes or so is the level to which the mom tries. After that, suddenly the mom changes her behavior. She no longer helps the baby, she actually actively goes and attacks the baby with her horns, you can see the sharp horns, and then tosses the baby up into the air several times till, you know, it punctures vital organs and basically till the baby dies. Now, in this particular case, obviously this is not a carnivore, so it is not really eating the, you know, or trying to eat the baby, it is essentially trying to relieve itself of the burden of taking care of a weak baby which would have died on its own anyway. So, that is the third one, and the final one is very interesting. This is in some sense restarting reproduction. So, we have been talking about the males killing off unrelated babies so that the females start reproducing again. But here you have a situation where the male is killing its own babies. So, how does it work? So, this is the barred chin blenny, it is found in the coral reefs of western Pacific Ocean. So, typically what happens is that the male goes and create, you know, this is coral living in the coral reefs, right. So, it goes and gets hold of some nesting site, typically some hole in the coral or some other site, and then the male stands guard over there, and the females, it starts guard and it starts courting the females. The females come, they mate with the male, they deposit their eggs and then they leave, and the males, they will stand guard over there and they are going to take care of the babies. So, taking care of the babies or the eggs in this particular case is that fanning behavior. So, if you remember, we discussed that in some fishes the male fish typically stands guard over the eggs and it keeps on having a flow of water over the eggs. Why? Because that flow of eggs ensures that the eggs are aerated, it ensures that there is no algal or any other kind of growth on the eggs, and that is essential for the eggs to hatch. So, that is the same fanning behavior is shown by this particular fish. Now, obviously not all females are equally fecund, right. So, it is not the case that the number of eggs laid by the females is large in all the cases. Turns out, if the number of eggs is less, and people have figured out that if the number of eggs is about 1000 or so, then rather than courting more females, the males they kill or eat the eggs. Okay, this is the very interesting part. Sometimes they eat, but many a times they simply kill them without eating them. So, it is not really a case of recovering resources, they are killing them for some other reason. What is the reason? Very interesting. Turns out that when the eggs are present, the male's androgens, the male hormones, testosterone and some of its analogues, those levels are lower in the presence of the eggs. And when that level is low, then the male is not able to court the females properly. Okay, so, they have to expend a certain amount of energy to court the females, and if they are not courting vigorously, the females will not come. And therefore, in the presence of the eggs, the males are not able to court the females sufficiently to get hold of matings. Therefore, when the males end up killing the eggs, that leads to a sudden boost in their androgen levels, and now the male can court the females very vigorously. And that is why if they have a small brood, remember in the context of fishes 1000 is nothing, right. So, they have a type 3 survivorship curve, which means that the death in the early phase of the life is very high. So, if you have only 1000 eggs, the chances that you are going to get any surviving offspring out of that is relatively low. Therefore, instead of wasting time with a small brood, the male gets a benefit because it can now start immediate courtship with other females who hopefully will be able to lay much more eggs, of which some are going to survive. So, this is what we know about the parents side of the story, and as you can see, the parents they do all kinds of things to increase their own fitness, right. And in many cases actually killing of the organisms do end up increasing the parents' fitness, which is why they are doing it. Now, obviously, you are going to think that poor offspring, it is either a one-celled egg or it is not even born in some cases, or it is very weak and unformed in the early stage. The poor offspring has no real defense. But see, in the context of evolution, which is happening over a long time, any trait that the offspring is able to develop, which ends up enhancing the offspring's fitness, that ultimately is going to benefit, or it is going to have an evolutionary effect in terms of the species success, right. Therefore, turns out that the offspring, they also do not really sit idle. They have ended up evolving a large number of characters which can enhance their success rate, evolutionary success rate, even if the parents are not necessarily trying to help them, or even if it is conflicting with what the parent is trying to do. And perhaps the biggest example of exploiting the parents happens in mammals, particularly primates like us humans. So, this is a picture of a fetus inside a mother's womb, and also, as all of you know, the fetus is connected in primates and particularly humans, the fetus is connected to the mother's uterine wall of the uterus with this structure called the placenta. Now, the placenta is perhaps one of the biggest and the hottest battlegrounds that you can find between mothers and offspring, particularly in primates. So, for example, in humans, these placental cells, they will actually go and they will sit on the mother's artery, right, and they will invade inside the mother's artery. Now, normally the mother should be able to control how much resource she is sharing with the fetus by constricting those arteries. However, once the placental cells go there, the first thing that they do is that they kill off the smooth muscle cells of the arteries, because of which the mother's arteries are no longer under the mother's control. She cannot contract them anymore because there are no muscle cells, right. And then they synthesize all kinds of growth factors, because of which the mother's artery grows larger. What is the result? two results. Number one, the mother's blood is directly coming in contact with the placenta. There is no barrier in between, and the mother is not even able to control the flow of the blood. As a result, the mother has no control over how much nutrition the offspring is getting. The offspring can, and it actually does all kinds of things, as I will show you in a second. It does all kinds of things to pump out as much of nutrition as it can from the mother. And this invasiveness of the placenta is actually a huge thing in the context of primates and particularly humans. So, you know that when a baby is being carried by a human mother, then abortion is possible only up to a certain point. If the age of the mother or the age of the fetus is beyond a certain point, abortion is no longer advised. Why? That is because the placenta, as I told you, actually goes and invades the mother's uterine wall and its arteries in such a way that essentially the mother has no control now. At that point, if you are doing abortion and you are tearing off the placenta, then the mother's tissues over there are paralyzed, right, and it is pumping blood at a huge rate. So, because of that, there is typically very huge amount of bleeding that happens, which is why miscarriage at slightly advanced stages is extremely dangerous for the human mother. But this invasion of the uterine wall is probably one of the simpler things that the fetus is doing. There is also a massive amount of chemical warfare that is going on. So, in humans, the placenta releases a hormone which is known as the human placental lactogen, HPL. Now, what this HPL does is very interesting. So, you know that in our body, the amount of sugar or glucose in the blood is controlled by this hormone called insulin, right, which is coming out of the pancreas. Now, what this HPL does is it reduces the maternal insulin sensitivity. Okay. Because it does that, so this is essentially saying that it reduces the ability of insulin to control the amount of glucose in blood, to reduce the amount of glucose in blood. What will happen? As a result, the maternal blood glucose level, that is going to go up, and when not only that, what HPL does is it also reduces the mother's ability to use the same glucose, okay, because if the glucose is not being absorbed inside the cells, the mother is not even getting the glucose that it is producing, right, or it is having. So, the maternal blood glucose level goes up and the mother's ability to use the glucose goes down, and because the mother is not using the glucose, obviously there is more glucose in the blood. Now, remember, this blood is going to the placenta, and from the placenta this glucose is getting absorbed by the fetus. Therefore, this essentially ends up increasing the amount of nutrition that the fetus is getting. Now, in the context of primates and humans in particular, this is huge because much of the energy that the baby is getting, it's being used for the development of its brain. And remember, much of the development of the brain actually ends up happening during the fetal stage, and that is because this is the only stage where it has access to so much of nutrition that it can essentially pull from its host, which in this case is the mother. Now, normally the mother has ways by which it can take care of this thing that the baby is doing, increasing its glucose level. But sometimes that control by the mother ends up failing, and when that happens, then the mothers get what is known as gestational diabetes. Essentially, their sugar levels become abnormally high. Now, what I gave you is a very small description of the entire war that is happening between the mother and the offspring. So, in the context of humans, this tussle between the mother and the offspring, if you want a fabulous non-technical account of that, I will strongly recommend this particular essay to you. This is a 24 14 articles. So, obviously, there are many molecular discoveries which happened after that, which you will not get in this article. So, today we know even more than what is presented in this particular piece, but what it talks about over here is fascinating to begin with. So, this is the first thing that the offspring is doing. It is absolutely actively trying to exploit its parents. The other thing that the offsprings can do, and they often do, is to try and exploit their siblings. Again, remember, 100% relatedness with itself, 50% relatedness with its full sibs. Therefore, if there are other claimants to the resource that the parent is giving, if you can bump off those claimants, it is good for you, right. So, one of the ways in which it happens is what is known as adelphophagy. So, this is the rather dangerous looking sand tiger shark. Although it looks this dangerous, apparently it is not very harmful to humans, it does not really attack humans at all. Now, in this particular species, the females, they end up mating with multiple males, and therefore, inside their belly they have many, in the uterus, that is, they have many embryos. Now, these embryos start growing, and at some stage one of the embryos, the one that is known as a hatchling, that ends up killing and eating all its siblings inside the uterus itself. Okay. So, even if they are starting with some 30-40 embryos to begin with, end of the day only one baby is going to come out of this mother, right. And this is what is known as intrauterine cannibalism. Cannibalism is when members of a species eat their own species, intrauterine, inside the uterus, also known as adelphophagy. Now, this is a very special case of a generic phenomena, what is known as siblicide, and siblicide simply is when one offspring ends up killing another. So, again, pretty well known. I am showing you one example, I will show you one more in the next slide. So, this is a bird known as the Nazca booby, and they lay eggs, but the eggs are not laid at the same time. One egg is laid earlier, the second egg is laid later, and in this particular case you have what is known as obligate siblicide, which means that this chick which has come out of one egg, this is the firstborn, this is going to kill this one, the second one, when it emerges. Okay. So, this is obligate siblicide. There are other cases where you have facultative siblicide, which means that siblicide happens, brothers or sisters are killed, but only when there is resource constraint, and that kind of a thing happens, for example, in the spotted hyenas. Okay. So, these are animals you find, as you know, in Africa, spotted hyenas, and these guys, the mother, she normally gives birth to 2 cubs. Okay. Sometimes 3 cubs are also produced, but typically 2 cubs are produced. Now, when 2 cubs are produced, if the mother is giving a lot of care, either because she is capable of giving a lot of care, or the environment is such that she is able to give a lot of care, in that case the chances of siblicide are less. It is not 0, but it is less. But when the mom is not able to give adequate care to both, then there is a very high chance then one of the cubs is going to kill the other. Okay. And this is the interesting part. When siblicide is going to happen, the killer cub is typically the one which ends up getting more resources from the mother before it has killed the siblings. So, probably this is the one which ends up getting more resources, therefore getting a little stronger, and therefore this is the one that ends up killing its siblings. Now, very interestingly, in this species, the mother does not modulate the amount of food that she is bringing, the amount of care that she is giving. Now, because of this, the entire amount of care that was earlier getting divided into 2, that entire amount of care now goes to that killer cub, and because of this, the growth rate of the cub which has killed its sibling, that increases significantly. So, there is a very visible benefit of killing your sibling in the spotted hyenas. Now, with this we will come to an end of killings or conflicts that are somehow amongst related individuals, relatives. There is one more kind of conflict which happens between males and females, is a sexual conflict, and I mean I should have probably included it in the previous week's discussion, but that discussion was anyway pretty long. So, that is why I have brought it over here in this context when I am dealing with other kinds of conflicts. So, these are known as inter and intra-locus sexual conflicts. So, what really happens here? So, in the context of inter-locus sexual conflict, these occur through the interaction of two or more different loci in males and females, resulting in the deviation of either or both sexes from the fitness optima for the traits, which in simple words means that let us say you have the male has certain traits which is improving its fitness at the cost of the female's fitness, and the female has some other traits which is allowing it to resist that. Now, in the context of behaviors, a lot of conflict is behavioral, right. So, in the context of behavior, we nowadays know that many of these are actually related to the genes, but for a long time people thought that many behaviors are simply environmentally stimulated. So, this intralocus, interlocus, these are explicitly coming in the context of those behaviors where we have reasons to believe that the behaviors have a genetic basis to them. That is why they are talking about loci. So, in the context of interlocus conflicts, the conflict is between some genetically modulated traits which are localized in males due to some loci which are only expressed or present in the males, and another set of traits which are related to loci which are only there in the females. Okay. So, basically genetic traits which are expressed either in the males or in the females. Now, to give you one example, so this is a mating Drosophila, okay, fruit flies. We know that when the Drosophila male mates with the female, then along with the sperm it actually ends up giving a host of other proteins, introducing a host of other proteins into the reproductive tract of the female, and these are taken together known as seminal fluid proteins or SFPs. Now, turns out that these SFPs play a major role in terms of modulating the behavior of the female in a way which is not necessarily good for the female. So, these proteins, they actually end up speeding up the egg production rate of the females. Now, how does this help the male? So, remember the Drosophila female mates with multiple males, right. So, the more number of males the Drosophila female is going to mate with, and the longer she stores the sperm inside her, the chances that she will end up or some other male's sperm is going to fertilize the egg increases. On the other hand, if and there is something known as last male preference in Drosophila females, which means that the male which has ended up mating the last in a sequence, that male sperms typically will end up fertilizing more number of eggs. So, if you speed up the egg production, then the chances of the male who has just now mated, that male sperms fertilizing a lot of eggs goes up. Similarly, Drosophila females, they mate multiple times, so there is remating. So, obviously, the faster the Drosophila female remates, the worse it is for the males. Why? Because I told you last male preference, right. So, the longer the female takes in remating, the more is the chance that the male which has mated now, that its sperms are going to fertilize the eggs. So, if there is something that can cause a delay as far as possible in terms of remating, then that is excellent for the male, but obviously for the same reason it is not good for the female, okay, because she is not getting more sperms, more choices in terms of fertilization. And of course, some of these also are known to reduce the lifespan of the female. So, you can see this is good for the male, but bad for the female. And people have figured out in many of these cases which are the specific proteins which are responsible for causing all these harmful effects. Now, of course, the female is also not taking this lying down. The female has also evolved certain traits to resist all these harmful effects, and for example, the female actually has evolved genes that end up promoting remating, which is against the effect of the delay in remating caused by some of these SFPs. So, here is the reference which interested people can look up. So, this is about interlocus sexual conflict, where the conflict is happening, but what the male is doing and what the female is doing, these are being controlled by different traits. Okay, and because they are being controlled by different traits, the assumption is that they are being controlled by different loci in the individuals. Contrast this with what is known as intralocus sexual conflict. Okay. So, this is the canonical example of intralocus sexual conflicts, the tail of the peacock. So, on the left side I am showing you a peahen, the female, and the right side I am showing you a peacock. Now, think about it. The peacock, as we have already discussed, has evolved a long tail because of sexual selection. Awesome. But when a peacock is reproducing, it is producing males and it is producing females, offsprings of both sex. Now, this gene which is, or set of genes which is leading to longish tail, when that is expressed in a peahen, the female, what is it going to do? If it ends up creating a long tail in the peahen, what benefit does the peahen does? As far as we know, peacocks, that is the males, do not have an extra preference for females with a long tail. On the other hand, if it has a long tail, it is going to have the whatever, it is going to be more vulnerable to the predators, right. So, its fitness is going to go down simply because its chances of getting caught increases. So, the same long tail which in the male is benefiting it by getting it more matings is actually harmful for the female of the same species. So, intralocus sexual conflict is a form of sexual antagonism that arises when the same genes control the same phenotype in both sexes, but the optimal trait values for males and females are very different. Right. So, this is what you have to understand. When the same trait is going to have different fitness in the male and the female, that is when you are having a case of intralocus sexual conflict. And just to say the same thing in slightly different language, it appears in all those cases where the direction of selection at a given allele depends on whether it is the allele is being expressed in males or whether the allele is being expressed in females. Now, what intralocus sexual conflict does is that it can, because of this, selection which is benefiting things in one sex will end up hampering adaptive evolution in the other, and the thing that intralocus sexual conflict can often lead to is the evolution of sexual dimorphism. Now, how exactly will that happen? So, again we are presenting a graphical representation of the whole thing, but people have actually modeled this in a nice way and have figured out all the various conditions, genetic conditions under which these kind of things can happen. We are not going into those genetic details, but I am just showing you the stages through which sexual dimorphism can evolve because of intralocus sexual conflict. So, let us assume that we have a trait and this is the distribution of the trait in the population, right. And what we also have is the fitness surface. What is the fitness surface? So, the fitness surface is simply telling me that for a given value of the trait, what is the fitness value, okay. And right now there is no conflict over here. So, the same fitness surface operates for both the male and the female. So, what you see over here is that the trait distributions optima maxima is here, and this is where the fitness is also maximized, makes sense. Now, assume that there is some change that has happened in the population, whatever that change might be, some mutation or something, some change in the environment, something, and because of that the trait distribution still remains the same, but the fitness surface, the fitness distribution for the male and the female have now changed. So, now the the female has a fitness optima over here, fitness maxima over here, whereas the male has a fitness maxima over here, right. Now, the trait distribution is still the same, but the females are facing one kind of a fitness surface, the males are facing a different kind of a fitness surface. And when that happens, that is where you have the conflict starting. Okay. Something that is good for the female is bad for the male and vice versa. Now, when this happens, typically the females will start evolving towards this maxima, this fitness maxima, the males will start evolving towards this fitness maxima, such that the trait distribution between the female and the male, that itself will start separating itself out. So, you can see that here the trait distribution has started separating, it has started becoming bimodal, and the female trait maxima is going in this direction, the male trait maxima is going in this direction. This is kind of like disruptive selection, except that it is happening within the same species, and this is why it is called partially resolved conflict. And when this keeps on happening, the two trait distribution will move further apart from each other, and at some point the male and the female trait distributions will completely separate out from each other, and this is where you will get sexual dimorphism, when the male and the female will have a totally different trait distribution, maybe in terms of size, body size, or maybe in terms of plumage color, or maybe in terms of some kind of gene expression, we do not know what it is, but the male and the female will end up having two different distributions which are not overlapping, and the the female's trait distribution maxima will again coincide with the female's selection fitness maxima, and same for the males. Okay. As I said, people have worked out what are the underlying genetic conditions needed for this kind of a event to happen, but we are not going into that, we are just showing you what the process is going to look like. Now, do we have reasons to believe that the intralocus sexual conflict occurs? We have a few examples. So, this is one example from a species that we have already met. This is the red deer, and what people have shown is that male red deers which have relatively high fitness, if you look at their daughter's fitness, their fitness is negatively correlated, okay, and vice versa obviously, right. So, this tells you that what is being turning out to be good for the male is turning out to be bad for the females. Similar example in the context of this bird, this is again we have met this bird before, this is a collared flycatcher, and in this particular case they looked at fitness in terms of survivorship from fledging to breeding. Fledging is when the birds leave the nest, and breeding is when they reproduce, and turns out that selection acts very differently on body size of males and females during this period. So, turns out that males, if they are smaller in size, they end up getting higher fitness, females get higher fitness only if they are larger in size. So, you can see it is the same trait, but it is acting in different ways in the males and the females. Females are getting benefit if they are larger, males are getting a benefit if they are smaller. So, we are going to stop our discussion on conflicts over here, but you can already see that this kind of a situation can lead to dimorphism, right. And as you know that dimorphism or production of very different morphs, that of course we are talking about sexual dimorphism, but if that dimorphism is not happening at the level of across sex, but it is happening at the level of populations, then that can lead to the formation of new species, right. And if you remember, right at the introduction level, I had said this is one of the big questions in biology: how exactly are new species formed, what are the conditions required for that. And we have looked at many of the evolutionary forces that are operating on various organisms and populations. With all that information, now we are in a position to tackle this big question. However, that is what is going to happen in the next discussion. See you then.